Well, good morning. Man, how are you guys feeling today? Good? Man, is anybody in the Christmas spirit yet? Anybody? If you? All right, that's good. I know personally I have been struggling just a little bit to get going, and I know we've got the lights are going and the music's playing everywhere, but it's been a struggle for me this season. So the other night we turned on what I believe is maybe the greatest Christmas movie ever made. That is, of course, Gremlins. And man, when that song, Christmas Baby Come Home, starts playing the opening scene, it just stirred my spirit. I am ready to go. I'm excited. You know, Christmas time here at Bridgepoint, we have a lot going on. So real quick, 3 things I want to bring to your attention. The first one is that 6 days from today, so it's next Saturday, we have our annual Giving Hope shopping experience that's going to be happening. And man, you guys have just blown us away over the last month. You guys have been bringing in gifts. I actually was helping somebody bring in some gifts this morning. I said, I think I might just put these in my car. These are some good gifts that you guys brought in. I know, like hoverboards and all sorts of amazing things. And so what we're going to do this Wednesday night, we're going to transform our church into this shopping mall. And next Saturday, we've got 6 families, potentially a few more being added in because I have a hard time telling people no. And so we're excited to welcome these families. They'll come in on Saturday, drop their kids off for crafts and cookies. It's going to be amazing. The adults will get a warm breakfast. They're going to hear a message of hope. And then they'll be in this auditorium shopping for gifts for their family. And the reason I love this, we've put our own unique twist on this. These families will actually pay $1 per gift. And the reason is because we want them to have the dignity of knowing they provided Christmas for themselves. Giving Hope is not about us being the hero. It's just about us providing an opportunity for these parents to be the hero this Christmas. And so if you'll join me in just praying for that, I will tell you what, your generosity blew us away, not just in the number of gifts, but all of our serving slots got filled up for that event. If you do want to help, there are 2 ways that you can do that. Again, you could join us here in the auditorium Wednesday night at 8 p.m. We need help kind of taking chairs out and bringing tables in and setting up gifts, so we'd love for your help with that. The other thing you can do is we do incur a cost to do this because there's certain things we want to give every family that don't count as a gift, like diapers for everybody who has an infant. We want to bless the adults as well. And so if you want to give to help cover some of those financial costs, you can go to our website or the Church Center app. And if you click on giving, there's a little drop-down box that says Giving Hope. You can just click that, and anything you can give to help us defray those costs would be awesome. So that's next Saturday. And then the very next day, next Sunday, is our Above and Beyond Sunday. And that's where once a year we set this day aside. And as a church family, we want to give above and beyond our normal tithes and offerings. And this really funds a lot of our missions efforts here at Bridgepoint. So last year, you guys gave so much, we were able to feed an entire school in Kenya for this entire year of 2022. And the year before that, we were able to bless our missionaries in Southeast Asia with a vehicle so they can get to some of these remote villages. And we never know exactly what it's going to look like in terms of how we're going to use that money. We know it goes towards missions, but it's because we never set a financial goal. That's not really what it's about. But if you call Bridgepoint your home church, we do set a participation goal. And so we've been talking for the last month now, we're talking every week about this and encouraging you to pray. And just ask God what he would have you give. That's all we want you to do, is just listen to God and do what he's asked you to do. And this is where this week I'm going to ask you now not just to pray, although keep doing that, but if you're married, I want you to start talking to your spouse. I want you to talk to your family. If you have friends who speak into your life, invite them in that conversation. Because what I have found is this is the week where my wife and I usually start like trying to zero in on the amount God's speaking to us. And it's through those conversations we come into alignment with each other and with God. And so next Sunday is going to be a big celebration. We've got some exciting things in store. You won't want to miss it. That's next Sunday. And then the last thing is Christmas Eve is right around the corner. And so we're having our annual candlelight services. We have one at 4 o'clock, one at 5:15. They're identical services. You're not going to miss anything. But we would ask if you could please go to our website at bpc.life and just reserve seats. And it's not because we're going to turn you away at the door if you show up at a different service time or anything else, but it helps us just plan to make sure we have enough seats and enough stuff to make sure that it's the best Christmas Eve service we've ever had. And so, again, you can do that on our website at bpc.life. Whew, we can all breathe. All right, that was a lot. I know. It felt like drinking from a fire hose. But today, we are kicking off this brand new Christmas series that we're calling Four Christmases. And you guys know I love movies, and Four Christmases is kind of a modern day classic. Now, I will tell you, like, you're like, oh, we're doing a series called Four Christmases. Let's sit down as a family. It's not a family movie, all right? So it's like, kind of in the Christmas vacation kind of realm in terms of humor. But what I do like about this movie is that it centers on Brad and Kate. And they both come from families where there's been divorce and remarriage and a lot of dysfunction. And so when they started dating, they said, we don't want to go down the same path our parents did. We're never going to get married. And one of the things they do is every year, to avoid the craziness of their family, they decide we're going to go on vacation instead of spend Christmas with our family. But at the beginning of their movie, and I'm not spoiling anything you're not going to see in the trailer, their plans get canceled, and so they have to go around and celebrate Christmas with each of their parents and step-parents. So they have 4 different Christmas celebrations, and of course, a lot of crazy things happen. But what's fascinating in that movie, they're all celebrating the same holiday, but there's 4 very different expressions of what Christmas looks like. And in the same way, in the Bible, we get 4 accounts of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we get 4 different expressions of what that very first Christmas looked like. So for the next 3 weeks, and then ending on Christmas Eve, we're just going to look each week at one of those accounts of Jesus' life and what it says about the Christmas story. And so today, we're going to jump in just a few minutes to Matthew chapter 2. And the story we read, it's going to be really familiar to you. In fact, if I could be honest with you for a moment, not that I wouldn't be honest with you normally, but pastors, at least for me, I hate teaching at Christmas time because you've all heard the story before, right? Like, how many of you have heard the Christmas story before? Not the movie. Some of you are liars. You've got your hand down. I know for a fact. How many of you have ever read a Christmas story to like a child or somebody, right? Like, we're familiar with it. Some of you have the little nativity scenes set up in your house or in your front yard. But the problem is sometimes we become so familiar with something that it loses its impact and its effect. I've shared this story before, but the first house my wife and I bought was built in 1972. And the reason I know that is because everything in that house was installed in 1972. Including in our main hall bath, the peel and stick tiles that were directly on the subfloor. And they had been there so long, there was no stickiness. It was like walking on a slide puzzle every time you went to the bathroom. And so we decided, we're going to fix this place up. We're going to make it look nice. And so we kind of rip everything out, and we put in this nice tile floor. It's great. But the one problem is that when you go from like peel and stick tile on a subfloor to adding in tile, you add about 1/2 inch onto where your floor used to be, which meant that the closet door could no longer fit back on the hinges. So I needed to shave off 1/2 inch. But we have a saying in my family: the Spears do the first 99% of a project with such excellence, and then we move on. We never completely finish it, just kind of leave it how it is. And so for a while, we have other things to do, other projects to tackle. And so we'd go in to use the restroom, no door on the closet, not a big deal. But anytime we had guests over, they would use the restroom and come out and say, I don't know if you knew this, but there's no door on the closet. And I'm like, oh yeah, I've got to get around to that. Because we become so used to it, it didn't seem strange to us anymore. I think for some of us, we become so used to the Christmas story that it doesn't seem strange to us anymore. And what I want to try to do over the course of this series is take us back to what it actually would have been like. Because too many of us, we have this sanitized view of that first Christmas night. Right, like we have this picture, there's this nice stable, and all the animals are behaving and staying in the corner, and it's all clean, and Jesus is laying in the manger, and of course he's not crying, right? It's a silent night. I don't know if you've ever been around a birth before, but when my wife gave birth, there's a lot of screaming and crying, and then I calm myself down, and then she gives birth. And so, it is not a silent, there's gross things that childbirth is not beautiful. It was not a picture-perfect night. Can you imagine being there? Like, have you been around barnyard animals before? They don't smell good. Like, is there wet fur? Is there like stuff on the ground that you wish wasn't on the ground when you were giving birth? Did it smell like an animal's food? This is kind of the setting in which God entered into the world. And when we have sanitized it so much, we forget kind of how revolutionary Christmas actually was. And so this morning, I want us to jump into Matthew chapter 2, but as best we can we just approach this with fresh eyes to maybe almost as if we're reading this for the very first time. Let's jump in, Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him. Now, in these first two verses here, we're introduced to a lot of stuff. Now, the first thing that we want to point out is this. Jesus has already been born. All right, so we're kind of cheating on the Christmas story, but a lot of us in our nativity scenes, you get the wise men that are there. Well, they weren't there on Jesus' birth night, but there is this story that after he's born, in the days of King Herod, these wise men show up. Now, in order to understand the story, we've got to understand who these people are. And first, I just want to talk for a few minutes about who Herod is. So Herod was actually born in the country of Edom. Everybody say Edom. All right, so he is not originally from the area that he would eventually rule over, but he was born into a fairly successful, wealthy family. In fact, he had direct control over some of the spice trade route coming out of the Arabia area. And as he grew up, it wasn't enough for him just to have wealth. He wanted to have power and influence as well. Now, the way the Roman government was set up in that time, and in order to explain this, I want you to see kind of the reach of the Roman Empire. I mean, it kind of went from one side of the map all the way to the other. Now, that's a lot of land and a lot of people to govern, because remember, there were no cell phones. You couldn't just shoot off an email to somebody in these days. Like, this would take almost months to get from one side to the other, and to rule effectively over that, what Caesar did is he divided his kingdom up into several smaller states and installed kings who would rule over those. So you think kings in those days are like middle managers, right? They're ruling directly over, and then they make sure they kind of collect taxes and pay tribute to Caesar. There was one particular area that was always difficult for Rome to retain control over, and that was the area with Judea and Galilee. This is where the Jewish people lived, because the Jewish people believed that they had a divine right to be a sovereignly run nation. And so there were constantly uprisings and rebellions and revolts in that region. And in fact, there's one point where there's two leaders kind of fighting over who is going to rule and be king over this area. So Herod takes a trip to visit Caesar, and he brings with him a lot of money, right? And by the way, not much changes in politics, right, from thousands of years ago. He's going to take all this money to give a gift to Caesar, and then he says, Caesar, if you would install me as king over that region, I would make sure there's peace. Not only that, I'll make sure you get all the taxes you need, get it to you on a timely manner. And so Caesar grants Herod the right to be king over that region. But remember, there's still people fighting over who's going to be in charge. So he actually has to take his own soldiers and go in and conquer the land he's already been named king over. Right? So he knows what it's like to fight for his position, to fight for his power, to fight for his station in life. And so Herod kind of takes over control of that area, and he takes on the name King of the Jews. Now, how do you think that the Jewish people in that area feel about being ruled by a king who calls himself King of the Jews, but he's actually from Edom? They didn't appreciate that at all. And so Herod, in an attempt to legitimize his claim to the kingship, marries a girl named Mariamne, or Miriam, and she was a Jewish princess. And he married her because that would bring legitimacy to his throne, but he also married her because he loved her. In fact, he's kind of an interesting dude. When she died, he had her embalmed in honey, think Carbonite Han Solo in Star Wars, so that he could go and visit her body and see her even after her death. But being married to the princess of the Jews gave him some claim to be king of the Jews. But he knew that was tenuous at best, so he was always worried about an uprising. He was worried about the Parthians in the east or the Egyptians from the south. And so he knew that in order to stave off threats to his throne, he really needed two things. Number one, he was going to need troops from the Roman Empire. And number two, he's got to keep up his wealth. So he has to figure out, how do I get inroads for my spice trade into the Roman Empire? So one of the first things he does as king of the Jews is he decides he's going to build the biggest harbor in all of the Roman Empire. which is ambitious enough, but then you realize that there was not coastline suitable for him to have the biggest. So there was no natural harbor in all of his kingdom. And so what did he decide to do? Well, he literally reshaped the coastline to build this harbor. And in fact, it became one of the wonders of the ancient world because he figured out ways to dredge out to make it a deep water harbor. He and his engineers developed a way to have concrete actually set and harden underwater. And it became the biggest port in all the Roman Empire. And as a tribute and to try to curry favor with Caesar Augustus, he built there a temple of Augustus, and then he also named the city after Caesar, and he called it Caesarea, which, by the way, if you read in the New Testament, Caesarea is a very important place. Paul is actually imprisoned here for a time. Peter spends some time in Caesarea, but this was like this beautiful city. In fact, he had marble imported and had like every walkway was marble, even so much so that if you were there today, in the sand is still remnants of that marble from over 2,000 years ago. And so Caesar kind of Herod developed a name for himself, and he got this favor with Caesar. But he didn't stop there. He built a lot of other stuff, a lot of fortresses, temples. In fact, one of his fortresses was called Masada, and he kind of built it into the side of a cliff. He suspended a lot of it. It's beautiful. We don't have time to talk about it, but he did actually have enough food stored there to last him 100 years. Or like talk about the wealth and the engineering and the ingenuity to develop something that's going to keep food fresh in the Middle East for 100 years. But maybe his crowning achievement was a building called the Herodium. Now, he was ruling right outside of Jerusalem, and he wanted to build a temple and a fortress, so if he ever had to flee, he'd be able to flee to a place right outside the city, and he would kind of rule and reign from there. And he really wanted this one specific site because right there is where he won a decisive battle early on in his kingship, and he wanted his fortress to be on top of a mountain. But there's a problem, because there wasn't a mountain there. And so what did Herod do? He literally built a mountain to put his fortress on. In fact, archaeologists still are not quite sure how he constructed this mountain, but this palace was so large, it actually had 3 different levels. The lower level was this colonnade, and it had a pool. In fact, it was the biggest pool in the Middle East. It was so big that in the middle of the pool, there was an island with a building, and the only way to get to that island was by boat. I mean, that's how big the pool was. And it was filled with water in an area where it hadn't rained in 800 years. That's just the lower level. You get to the middle level, and this is kind of where Herod did a lot of his day-to-day kind of dealings, where he would meet with people. In fact, that's likely where the wise men came to have their conversation with Herod. And then at the very, very top, he added on top of the mountain to even more mountain and had his fortress put up there. And this Herodium loomed over the region. In fact, you could see all of Jerusalem. You could actually probably see Bethlehem from there. Bethlehem was a small village, maybe 300-400 people, that was literally in the shadow of Herod's reign and rule, which is fascinating because that meant that every time that Jesus came in and out of Jerusalem, he probably passed right by this place. And this was such an architectural feat that there was a saying in that day that said, Herod has such vision that he can move mountains. We found this inscription in multiple places. And the whole idea is like he has the vision, he has the power, he has the strength, he has the resources, he can carve out coastline, he can build a mountain, he can do it all. Which is fascinating because Jesus, at one point in his ministry, is standing on the Mount of Olives with his disciples within eyesight of the Herodium, and he turns to them and says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can move mountains. You could say to this mountain, move, and it would be thrown into the sea. And I think a lot of times we think Jesus is saying, if you just believe enough, then big things will happen. Like just believe it into existence. That's not what he's saying. Remember, faith is about being faithful. Jesus is saying, if you're faithful to me, if you follow me, if you live your life for me, then whatever you think Herod did that was great, what you'll do is even greater than that. Because one day, Herod's stuff, it won't be there. It will not stand the test of time, but my kingdom will. If you follow me, you'll do even greater things than Herod. Now, how is Herod going to pay for all of these building projects? It's got to be through taxes, right? How does the government pay for anything? They take money from the people that they rule over. Now, in that day, Herod's got to collect taxes for the Roman Empire. He's got to collect taxes for himself, and then the tax collectors will pad their pockets as well with extra fees. So the effective tax rate during Herod's rule and reign was 70 to 80%. And what many scholars think is at the time Jesus was born, it was closer to 90%. 90% of their income was going to Herod. Can you imagine that? And there's these Jewish people who had land that had been passed down through generations that now they're having to sell that land. Now they're having to go into indentured servitude. Why? Because they've got to pay Herod. Meanwhile, he sits in his palace with his 100 years worth of food, sitting in his pool with all of his dignitaries, and he's living the high life, and we're being oppressed. We're having everything taken from us. And to make matters worse, even when Herod tries to do something to curry favor with the Jewish people, he shoots himself in the foot. Like he builds this beautiful temple so they can go in and worship God, but right at the entrance, he puts a statue of a golden eagle, which was the symbol of the Roman Empire. It'd be like kind of the equivalent of if at our church we had to hang an American flag or a golden eagle. It was this idea that Herod wanted the Jewish people to go into the temple, and it's as if he was saying, you know what, you can go and worship your God. You can make sacrifices and sing songs. You can tell the stories about how he delivered you from Egypt in the past. You can do all that. But don't forget who's really in charge here. Don't forget who's really king of the Jews. That's me, and that's Rome. And so throughout his reign, he was constantly having to put down rebellions. In fact, he killed anyone he thought was a threat to his throne. Remember the girl Mariamne we talked about, who he had her embalmed, and he actually had her killed, the love of his life, because he thought she was a threat to his power. He loved power even more than he loved his own family. He had multiple of his sons executed because he was afraid that they were going to try to overthrow him. And one last story about Herod, because I know you're like, all right, we get it. You love Herod. Okay, I don't love Herod, but I'm just trying to paint the picture of who he is. He's nearing the end of his life, and he has what most doctors believe today is syphilis. His body, his reproductive organs are literally rotting, and the stench is so bad that his attendants could not be in the room for more than a few moments before they would start to get violently ill or even pass out. And as one of these attendants is in taking care of Herod, he makes the comment, you know, no one's going to shed a tear when you die. Well, Herod said, I have a solution to that as well. So he has some of the most loved and influential people rounded up, put in the Colosseum under watch by guards, and he said that as soon as I die, I want all these people executed. So even if the people don't shed tears because I die, there will be tears that are shed on the day that I die. Now, on the day where Herod dies, they actually get ready to execute them, but his son had immediately became king, and he put a stop to the execution. He said, no, we're not going to do this. He knew there was going to be a revolt, like the whole kingdom would have split apart. Now, all of that would have been well and good, except that apparently Herod hadn't actually died. Somebody miscommunicated that to his son, and when Herod woke up and found out what his son did, he knew exactly what to do. He threw a dinner party and invited a ton of people over, and in the middle of the party, he had his son attached to a strangulation device. And with each course of the meal, they tightened that device a little bit more. And as they ate their dinner, his own son gasped for his breath and finally died. And that was celebrated with finishing the meal together. Are you talking like a brutal man? Nobody liked Herod. In fact, Caesar had this quote. He said, it's better to be Herod's swine than his son. Because if you're his pig, at least there's a chance he won't kill you. But if you're his son, he will definitely kill you. He's not a nice guy. But he had a ton of power. He had a ton of influence. He could influence Caesar himself. He had a ton of wealth. He may have been the richest person on the face of the earth during this time period. He had it all. And he was king of the Jews. Except that our story begins with some wise men coming from the east. And they approached Herod and they said, we're here to find the king of the Jews. Now, who are these wise men? You know, again, in the nativity scene, sometimes we think there were 3 of them. Nowhere in this story does it say that there are 3 wise men. We know they brought 3 different gifts, But throughout history, Christians have depicted it as 2 or 3 or 4, or even 12. What likely is the case that this was actually an entire entourage of these advisors to the Persian king that were sent. Now, why is that likely? Because in 66 BC, there was a man named Tiridates. Don't you love ancient names? It's like, that's fun to say, Tiridates. All right, now he was ruling in Persia, and he knew that the Roman Empire was going to threaten to come out and to take him over. And so he proposed, why don't we pay you tribute, and then I'll kind of rule and do my own thing. You'll get money from us, and we call it even. The Roman emperor said, that's fine, but I want you to come see me so I can put the crown on your head so I can still tell my people that we conquered. And so Tiridates and all of his envoy of magi come from the east to Caesar, and they bow down to pay homage, and they bring all of these great gifts to lay at his feet to say, you are truly Lord and King of all. And it says that these wise men, these magi, show up in Herod's court. They say, we're here to find the King of the Jews so we can worship him. The word worship there, by the way, it probably should be translated as pay homage to. They weren't thinking he was the Son of God. They're just like, you're just like that Caesar. This is the true king. And kind of grasp how ridiculous this is. They show up to the King of the Jews to ask where to find the King of the Jews. I feel like if you got to sit down with the president and say, hey, do you think you could introduce me to the president? It's like, well, that's ridiculous. But notice Herod's response in verse 3. It says, when King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod was disturbed at this question. Now, why do you think this was so disturbing? Because he realizes there may be a potential threat to his throne. We don't have time to get into the details, but we could assume that Herod, as king of the Jews, married to a Jewish princess, was probably somewhat familiar with Jewish stories. And there was a very popular one that was told in that time. And it's out of Numbers chapter 22. It's one of the weirdest stories in the Bible. It's about the king of Edom, which Herod probably heard this story and was like, hey, I'm a king from Edom as well. And the king from Edom had heard that the nation of Israel had been conquering all of his neighboring nations. And so he asked a prophet named Balaam, would you curse Israel so that Edom would be protected? And Balaam's like, no, I'm not going to do that, not going to do that. But eventually he agrees to meet with the king of Edom. So he hops on his donkey and he heads out to meet the king of Edom. And on the way, the donkey keeps bumping Balaam into the sides of these cliffs. And finally, Balaam gets off. He starts beating the donkey and saying, why are you doing this? And the donkey turns around and says, so yeah, there's a talking donkey like Shrek in this story. And the donkey says, why are you beating me? Can't you see there are angels blocking our way? And all of a sudden, God opens Balaam's eyes, and the angels say, listen, you're not to curse Israel. In fact, God only wants you to give a message to the king of Edom that I'm about to give you. And when you get to Numbers 24, we get what that message to the king of Edom was. Verse 17, Balaam says, I see him, but not now. I perceive him, but not near. A star will come from Jacob, and a scepter will arise from Israel. He will smash the forehead of Moab and strike down all the Shethites. Edom will become a possession. Seir will become a possession of its enemies, but Israel will be triumphant. So I wonder if Herod was familiar about this prophecy told to another king from Edom. That Balaam says, I see somebody coming, not now. I know there will be one coming in the future who will be like a star out of Jacob. He'll come from Israel, and who will lead his people to have victory over Moab, over the Shethites, and even over the king of Edom. And I wonder if when Herod heard that there had been born a king of the Jews, if he knew that there was somebody who was threatening to overthrow him, the king from Edom, the king of the Jews. Now, what's even more fascinating is it wasn't just Herod who was disturbed. It said all of Jerusalem with him. Now, remember, Herod's not a popular guy. Why would people in Jerusalem be disturbed that there'd be a new king? Well, there were likely some people who were longing for that day. So what Matthew's probably referring to is all the top advisors in Jerusalem, all the people who had benefited from Herod's reign, all the people who were wealthy, who were a part of the aristocracy, who had power and influence, all thanks to Herod, they were all disturbed because there's a threat to the throne. And by the way, we already know, Matthew's already told us who this King of the Jews is. It's Jesus. See, and I wonder sometimes if when Jesus shows up, those who are living lives of comfort and prosperity and security and safety, if we too would be deeply disturbed if Jesus showed up today. Because listening, following Jesus is not safe. Following Jesus is not always going to lead you into security. Following Jesus does not always mean you'll be prosperous. Following Jesus certainly doesn't mean that you will have power and influence. And when you have a lot of things, you have a lot of things to lose. And my fear is that many of us, if Jesus were to walk in today, we may find ourselves among those who are deeply disturbed because Jesus has come to flip everything on its head. So what is Herod's response? Verse 4. So he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the Christ would be born. In Bethlehem of Judea, they told him, because this was what was written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, report back to me, so I too can go and worship him or pay homage to him. So notice they come in asking for the King of the Jews. Herod's deeply disturbed, and he calls his advisors over and said, hey, what is that Messiah supposed to be? Where are they supposed to be born at? Say, well, in Bethlehem. You see down there, that little village, right? Like it's supposed to be there. And so Herod pulls the wise men to the side, and he says, hey, we think he's in Bethlehem. And when you go there, would you just come back and tell me? Because I would love to pay homage to him as well. Now, how many of us believe that Herod actually wants to pay homage to another king? Of course, nobody. We know what he wanted to do. He wanted to get rid of Jesus. See, there's kind of two approaches in this story to Jesus. Really, this story is a tale of two kings. Right? You have the King Herod, king of the Jews, the man who had vision to move mountains, who literally reshaped the coastline, who had power and wealth and security and prosperity. He had all of that stuff. And then there's King Jesus, born in a stable with dirty, smelly animals, born into a poverty-stricken city with family who's barely scraping by. And there's two approaches. Herod, he wants to find Jesus, but he wants to find Jesus what? So he can get rid of him. I wonder sometimes if when we approach Jesus, we want to hear what Jesus has to say, but there's parts of that we want to get rid of. Listen, I'm not saying like we want to kill Jesus in the same way Herod did. But listen, we find out some things about Jesus that deeply disturb us, and so what do? Well, I think that whole turn your other cheek thing, I don't think Jesus really meant that. Oh, that whole sell all your possessions and give to the poor, that couldn't mean what I think it means. We would constantly dismiss Jesus, and we say we want to worship him, and we want to pay homage to him, but how much do we only want to do that as far as it benefits us? Now contrast that with how the wise men approached Jesus. Verse 9. It says, after hearing the king, they went on their way. And there it was, the star they had seen at its rising, and it led them until it came and stopped above the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Herod was overwhelmed with despair. The Magi were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshipped him. They paid homage to him. And how did they do that? It says, then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their own country by another route. So we've seen how Herod approaches Jesus, but how do the wise men approach him? Well, when they get close, they're overwhelmed with joy. They have found the true King of the Jews. And when they find this child living in poverty, they do the unthinkable. They bow their knees and they submit to him. they pay homage to him, and they give these gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I mean, there's so much written in Christian history about what does the gold mean and frankincense and myrrh. And can I be honest for a moment? I ordered some frankincense that I was going to give to everybody, and Amazon didn't deliver the package in time. So this is going to be like this great moment in the sermon, and we were all going to pull out our frankincense because I don't know if you knew, I did not know this. Frankincense and myrrh, they actually are like tree sap chunks that have this aroma and this fragrance that come from the east. And we can talk about what do all these gifts mean. Like the gold was something you would give to a king. The frankincense is like that little that you can burn it. It smells good. The priests would use it in the temple as they facilitated worship. And myrrh was actually another fragrance they would oftentimes use in burial process. Kind of a weird baby shower gift, right? Like, glad you had a baby. Here's some embalming fluid. Like, I don't know. It's kind of strange. But, I mean, it really goes to show that even from the beginning, there was in some sense that Jesus was always looking forward to what would eventually happen. His death and his resurrection. How Jesus was king, he was priest, he was prophet. I mean, we can go into all that. Listen, a great church history and Christian teachers have gone into all that. Here's what I want us to take away, though. All of these were extremely common gifts to give to a king. And all of them were costly. See, when the wise men showed up and they found Jesus, their response was to submit, to pay homage, to give whatever they had to give. And see, here's what I find interesting, though. In this story, say, okay, the wise men knew who Jesus was. They believed he was the true king of the Jews. But they're not the only ones in the story who believed that. See, Herod believed it too. That's why he wanted to get rid of Jesus. See, the question that is before us, the question I think Matthew wants us to wrestle with is, who do you say is king? Because here's the reality. Both Herod and the wise men believed that Jesus was king. You can be here and you can believe that Jesus is king, but are you actually living as if Jesus is king? Because it's the tale of two kings. Right? Herod is the king who did everything he could to preserve his own power and wealth and status. And Jesus is the one who, even though he was God, did not consider equality with God something that could be exploited, but he laid that down. He laid down his very life for other people. Herod is the one with wealth and prosperity, and Jesus was homeless. Herod is the one who had strength and titles and might, and Jesus is the one who forgave his enemies even as they were crucifying him, who said, turn the other cheek, pray for those who persecute you. Who's king in your life? Man, I think the question we have to ask ourselves, if we look at our time, we look at our bank account, it'll tell you who the king is. Are you king? Are your kids king? Are your career goals king in your life? Or is it Jesus? But see, here's the thing I think that prevents a lot of us from living as if Jesus is king. Because if we can be honest for a moment, sometimes it's hard to say Jesus is king when Herod still sits on the throne. We live in a world where it feels like Herod is still reigning and ruling. Or like we want to believe that Jesus is healer, but the cancers come back. We want to believe that Jesus is our provider, but we've lost our job. We want to believe that Jesus is our protector, but we've been wounded by family, by friends, by our church. And we want to believe Jesus is king, but man, a lot of times we wonder, is Jesus sleeping on the job? See, here's the beautiful thing, though, about Christmas, is it's all well and good to celebrate Christmas and Jesus as the baby in the manger, and that's great. We celebrate the fact that light came into the world, that God became man. We celebrate that fact, but Jesus didn't stay in the manger. He became a man who lived his life to bring heaven to earth, and ultimately, he was crucified. And in that moment, it seems like Herod got the final word. It seems like the ways of the world conquered the ways of God, but 3 days later, Jesus rose again. And see, that is the hope of the Christian faith. In fact, Paul says, without the resurrection, we're fools. It doesn't mean anything because the resurrection says that no matter what the world throws at Jesus, Jesus gets the final word. Jesus is king. I don't know if you know this, Herod died. Caesar Augustus, long gone. There's kings and powers and principalities that have come and gone, but Jesus is still on the throne. And man, sometimes I can relate to what Jesus must have felt like living in the shadow of Herod. But today we celebrate that Jesus is king, that light has come to the darkness, and no matter what we're going through, Herod doesn't get the final word, Jesus does. And so really that means, what is our response going to be? Jesus is king. Like, you don't really get to decide if he's king, he just is king. And the rest of life is, all right, working that out. It's like the day I got in front of my family and friends and I married my wife, I said, all right, you're married. Like, that's the reality. And I get to choose to live if I'm married, and I get to choose if I'm going to live like I'm single. Listen, Jesus is king. The proclamation has already been made. Are we going to live like it? Or we live like we're king? Our family's king. Our career's king. Our finances are king. And if we really are going to follow Jesus, what does it look like to honor him? What sacrifice are we making? Will it cost us the same way it cost those wise men? And so in just a moment, we're going to continue in worship with a time of communion. And as we do, there's just two questions I want you to wrestle with. The first one is this: is Jesus my king? And I know, listen, we're in church, and so we're like, the right answer is yes. But really what I want you to do is think through your life. If people looked at your life, would they think that Jesus is your king? Then the second question is, if so, how do I honor him? What does it look like to take everything I have and lay it down at his feet? It's the tale of two kings. Which one will we serve today? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we're so thankful that you are king. And God, we're just honest that right now, for some of us, it's hard to believe that. Feels like the world just does whatever it wants to do. And there are some who are here today, and I know they are broken, they are wounded, they are hurting, their lives are full of pain. And right now they're not sure. Jesus, I just pray that in this moment you would minister to them. Your Spirit would comfort them, and I pray you would give them enough faith. Faith that could move mountains. I pray in this moment you would just reveal to us anything that we've put on the throne other than you. And we just, right now, we repent of that, Jesus. We want to honor you. We want to worship you. Help us to become more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen. As you feel led, you can take communion.